Hello, this is Outside the Fourth Wall. I'm your host, Mike Hammond, and today we're going to be discussing gendered performance in our everyday lives. Now, what does it mean to say that gender is performative? Judith Butler says, for something to be performative means that it produces a series of effects. We act and walk and speak and talk in a way that consolidates the impression of being a man or being a woman. So, when we break this down, what Judith is saying here is that a person isn't simply a man or a woman or anything in between, but rather they do things that make us and themselves perceive them as such. Right? This is not to denounce the sort of internalized reality, but rather to say that it's not as simple as that internalized reality. People dress and express themselves in a gendered way. It may be controversial, but Judith's idea here posits that we are not a specific gender to begin with, but that gender is produced by our actions and reproduced by how our actions are perceived. Now, I should note that this is not at odds with self-identification, like I was saying earlier. Judith Butler talks at great length in an interview with Verso, saying at one point, gender assignment is a construction, and yet many genderqueer and trans people refuse those assignments in part or in full. That refusal opens up the way for a more radical form of self-determination, one that happens in solidarity with others who are undergoing a similar struggle. She goes on to talk about the policing of this self-identification. She says here, the feminist police come along to expose the construction and dispute a trans person's sense of lived reality. I, in this case Judith Butler, oppose this use of social construction absolutely and consider it to be a false, misleading, and oppressive use of the theory. So, that's a lot. It's a big chunk. So let's let that sit for a second, let it digest. Feel free to pause the video, get some snacks, maybe have a nap, then come back. Once that's all settled in, you may wonder why specifically Butler mentions feminists here. Well, this is due to a group of feminists known as TERFS, or trans-exclusionary radical feminists. These are people who view the existence and rights of transgender people as somehow an attack or undercutting of their own gender identity. They seem to see people's gender expression or gender identity as somehow invalidating their own, or as an attack on their own ideas of gender. So these TERFs take something like gender theory and use it in a very misleading and undercutting way. They have an inability, it seems, to accept that others may have lived experiences that they themselves cannot fully understand, or that they have never experienced. And this sort of, the way that TERFs talk about and view other people's forms of gender expression as an attack on their own is sort of going to be the focus of the rest of this video. I've often seen people who fall into this trans-exclusionary category twist the post-structuralist framework that Butler outlines in order to attack or invalidate transgender people. In fact, there is a gender theorist, Sheila Jeffries, who is, for all intents and purposes, a TERF, and she writes, "It represents an attack on the body to rectify a political condition. Gender dissatisfaction in a male supremacist society based on a false and politically constructed notion of gender difference." The main issue with this line of thinking, though there are many, and they have been covered and taken down by many other greater minds than myself, is that it posits that being transgender is someone who, in their view, is a sex, and whose true gender must match that sex. They basically see transitioning merely as a means to fit into and to perpetrate a stereotypical form of the opposite gender, And before we even break that down, I can say matter-of-factly, I personally know transgender people who do not act stereotypically. I know trans men who wear dresses and makeup on occasion, just as I know cis men that do. But the bigger problem, and where this line of thinking begins to fall to shambles, is that transgender people transition not so that they can enact gendered stereotypes. I mean, any man can put on a skirt and do the washing up, and any woman can put on coveralls and fix a car. Because transgender people generally don't largely change the way they act or perform gender during transition. Where the difference comes in is in the reproduction of their gender, how they are perceived to be versus how they wish to be perceived. And also, for the most part, in the physical characteristics that work to perform a gender. Those do not align, and that causes a physical discomfort with one's own body. And hey, maybe after all of this, you really think that Sheila Jeffries and people of the TERF community are really, really onto something. And I mean, you have the right to hold whatever views you want. However, attacking people's various forms of gendered performance and their gender identities because it makes you uncomfortable is inhumane and leads to violence and to the deaths of many people who dare to perform their gender in a radical way. I am someone who often performs outside of the gender binary. I've been lucky enough to have a fairly supportive community, but I've still been jeered and mocked. I still get weird looks when I walk down the hallway, and I go to an arts school. People are uncomfortable when their boxes are pushed open, when the structures that they hold dear begin to crumble, and things maybe don't seem as clear-cut as they once did. But we cannot allow that fear or that ignorance to keep us trapped, to keep us performing like good little boys or girls. We need to acknowledge the fact that we're performing every day, and that when I choose to put on a blazer or a more feminine blouse, that is a costume choice I am making to tell you something about me. And you might perceive it in a completely different way than how I've meant it. And that's okay. That doesn't invalidate me, and it shouldn't be an attack on you. Thanks for watching. Leave a like and subscribe. References are in the description down below. And if you'd like to do some further reading on the post-structuralist view on gender, try picking up Gender Trouble by Judith Butler. Keep in mind, however, the book is about 30 years old, and certain elements of our social climate have changed. But it's still a pretty good read. That's it. You can go now.